Hi class, in today's lesson we're going to evaluate issues of ground and surface water pollution, and we want to ask ourselves, how do pollutants flow through a watershed? So there are two types of water pollution, point source and non-point source. So point source we say comes from a known and specific location. So this would be examples of factory pipes, leaking landfills, storage tanks. We can determine exactly where the pollution is coming from. But non-point source does not have a specific point of origin, meaning we don't really know where it comes from. So a big example of this that we'll learn today's lesson is runoff. So what is runoff? Runoff is simply just water flowing downslope along Earth's surface. So where can runoff go? Well, runoff has the ability to reach a stream, a river, or a lake. It might evaporate, or it can also accumulate as puddles in small depressions or like small divots in the ground and infiltrate or soak into the ground. So how does soil composition impact runoff? So the physical and chemical composition of soil affects its water holding capacity. So if there are spaces in the soil and rock that already contain water, new precipitation will either stay in the form of puddles or it can run downhill if the area has a slope. So how does the rate of precipitation impact runoff? So light, gentle, this should say, this is spelled incorrectly, gentle precipitation can infiltrate the dry ground. So if it's just lightly raining, most likely this water will just soak into the ground. But if the rate of precipitation is heavy, the water falls too quickly to infiltrate the ground and becomes runoff. So how does vegetation impact runoff? So soils that contain grasses or other vegetation can be in the form of plants, in the form of trees. This allows more water to enter the ground than soils that have no vegetation. So ultimately, if there are plants in the region, it can slow down the rate of runoff of surface water. So how does the slope of land impact runoff? The steeper the slope, the faster the water flows. As we can imagine, in areas with steeper slopes, much of the precipitation is carried away as runoff. So now we're going to go into these concepts of different forms of pollution. So eutrophication is the process by which runoff from the surrounding watershed increases bodies of water with nutrients that stimulate excessive plant growth. So you might have heard of this with algae, for example, in ponds or in lakes. So this is a natural process, but it can be sped up with the addition of nutrients from fertilizers. So for example, if runoff is coming from a farm that the farmer primarily uses fertilizers for its crops, and this gets essentially run downhill into a lake or a pond or some sort of water. This can stimulate excessive plant growth and can speed it up. So we're going to talk about this place called the Chesapeake Bay. So there's this thing called the Chesapeake Bay watershed. It is located in this red region. It's kind of starting, towards the bottom of New York. This is Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. DE is Delaware, and NJ is New Jersey. So we're going to watch this video. We're going to start at minute 10. Oh, okay, the video is no longer available. So, okay, we'll skip over that. But just to summarize, the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States. So it has so many different forms of biodiversity. That's where we get blue crab that you probably eat at your seafood restaurants, oysters, big old fish like the striped bass, and clams. So really no other estuary has more types of biodiversity and allows us to fish anymore. But the problem is this bay, the Chesapeake Bay, is not healthy. And so it has experienced eutrophication. Nutrient pollution caused these algae blooms, these little green things, and these green things actually suffocate the fish by depleting the oxygen in the water and then eventually kills the fish. So what causes the excess nutrients? Rivers and tributaries are bringing the nutrients to the Chesapeake Bay. So factory farms that we know, these farms here, they discharge 650 million pounds of chicken manure each year. That's really gross. And so this can also be caused by sewage as well that is drained into the bay. So this is how eutrophication works. There will be a normal ecosystem with low nutrient levels and algae stays in check, so it doesn't overgrow. But once you add nutrients, once you add things that don't quite belong there, it causes these things called algal blooms. So algae dies and becomes detritus or decaying matter, and the detritus is decomposed by microbes, and the microbe populations bloom. And as a result of this, there is low dissolved oxygen in the water, which then kills the fish and other organisms. And microbes use the oxygen in the water, and dead zones appear in the bay, and nothing can live there. So this is just another sort of diagram that allows you to see this. You see that excess use of chemical fertilizers will lead to runoff and groundwater contamination. So these fertilizers will then be traveling downhill into a lake, for example, or it can be dissolved into groundwater, which eventually enters lakes, ponds, and rivers. So we have increased nutrients that are absorbed by algae, and we have an increased decomposition of dead algae, which then uses up oxygen in the water. As a result of that, increased growth of algae will shade out other plants, which then also decreases the amount of oxygen that's in the water. And as a result, fish begin to die as oxygen levels fall. And not only fish, this includes crab, clams, oysters, all kinds of seafood that you probably love to eat. So water pollution is a really big thing that impacts us. Not only does it impact us and the types of food we get to eat, but it also impacts the biodiversity that is in our oceans and in our bays and lakes. And we know that once that biodiversity is harmed, it also threatens the ecosystem, and therefore, in the end, can also threaten our way of life. That's it for today's lesson. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.